Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, for the 20th anniversary of Survivor Africa, like I did for Borneo and the Australian Outback, I've decided to do a rewatch of the season, and here we'll be doing a retrospective of it. Now, Survivor Africa is a season that I've always had a level of reverence for. Now, I do think in the grand scheme of things, it is still a bottom half season for me, but I do feel like this season is very unique. And while it does contain some tropes that I dislike from older school seasons of Survivor, I did still find the rewatch of this season a lot more enjoyable than the rewatches I've had of many of the other older seasons. Obviously, a portion of that is due to its cast, which, while a bit inconsistent with a couple less memorable figures here, especially in comparison to the first two seasons, where it does feel like everyone from those seasons have some sort of legacy around them. Here you don't have that, but you still have these legendary figures of the game, people like Ethan, people like Lex. You have some great characters like T-Bird, you have Kelly Goldsmith, Clarence, Lindsay, you have some other notable figures that may be questionable figures nowadays, due to a lot of things that they did on the season not aging particularly well, but still having a pretty major impact on the season, and do make it a more entertaining product as a whole, with people again like Big Tom, Frank, and Silas. I do really love this cast, despite it not feeling as iconic as the first two seasons. Another thing that does make this season stand out is its locale, which is radically different from any other Survivor season outside of Gabon, and even then there are obviously significant differences between those two, with this being a mostly landlocked location, and you do notice right away just how rough the conditions are, particularly in terms of the heat and the water issues, which again, like typically I don't really care about this, but I do feel like this is one of those seasons that is an exception, where I did get some intrigue from some of these more standard camp segments of the show. So Africa is a season I overall do really like, and to go really in detail here, we'll be running through a season from beginning to end. So let's start off with the premiere, which starts off with the cast being transported onto location on board a massive truck, which does feel a lot less epic than the intros of the previous two seasons, but right away you do notice a massive split in ages of these players, which obviously does become a central storyline on Samburu, but even Baran does have a pretty similar split in age, which does make me wonder if it was purposely done. Like, I wonder if that was like maybe a thought in casting to do at one point, is to do like old versus young. As if they really wanted to, I do feel like they could have split the tribes that way. I did also find it interesting that when we do get the intros to the players, which is still in that old school style that I do like, of them running through each one of the players one by one, showing footage of them at home. But something I noticed here is that for some reason they point out if each of these players are a mother or a father, and that just felt like a bizarre choice there. I don't know why they felt like that was a necessity for the audience to know. But once they arrive, the players do have to carry all of their supplies to their camps, during which we do get some fun character moments, namely from Frank, who instantly takes charge of his tribe in a way that really irritates a lot of the younger players. We do get a great ridiculous line from him when he's asked about what branch of the military he's in, and he responds, "I was in the American branch called Freedom," which is a line I just always found really funny. We also have Linda talking about Mother Africa and being upset at the younger players for not respecting it, and this is obviously a setup for the feud that becomes a major storyline moving forward. On the Baran tribe, we do see them struggling with water, which again looked absolutely disgusting here, where they're essentially forced to drink this like mud water, and we do get this notable confessional from Lex where he talks about the ramifications of drinking it unboiled. We do eventually have Samburu winning immunity. And the rest of the content on Baran is mostly focused around Clarence, who first gets in trouble for eating 2 cherries when everyone else supposedly ate one, but the main attraction here is Beangate. This situation where Diane is weak after collapsing during the challenge, so while everyone else in the camp goes to get water, Clarence agrees to watch over her. And the entire time when the tribe is gone, like we get footage of them talking about how they're worried that Clarence is going to be stealing food. And then when they return, Diane does end up telling Tom about Clarence having given her a can of beans, to which Clarence admits to have eating some himself, leading to the entire tribe being pissed at him, where the big 3 of the season, and Lex, Tom, and Ethan, seem to be the most upset at him, with Tom even saying that he would have shot him if he had a gun. And all of this feels really icky. I mean, this obviously feels like there's some very clear racial undertones going on here with how Clarence is being treated, how he's being perceived even initially. It's definitely something that doesn't age particularly well. particularly Big Tom's role in all this. And by the end of this scene, we do have Diane really throwing Clarence under the bus as well, which, I'll be honest, I mean, if this is a gain move, I will give her some credit for taking this opportunity here, though obviously it isn't really clear if it was one. But by the time Tribal, it is pretty clearly between the two there, between Clarence and Diane, and we do see Big Tom voting for Clarence as a warning. And we do have this fun voting confessional from Clarence talking about how Diane isn't like his mother, but at the end of the day, Diane does get voted out here. And Diane is fine. I mean, I feel like she's one of these first boots that gets taken out due to her just being the clear weaker player on the tribe. She doesn't really get much positive content in this episode, with her getting the tribe lost during their initial trek. We have her collapsing during the challenge, and obviously then we have Beangate. So, and nothing really painting her in a flattering look, but really, she's just tough to assess as a player for me, as I just don't know if the entire Beangate situation was her actively doing it as gameplay, and I don't know if she really had a shot of ever staying, even if everything had gone perfectly. Now for episode 2, where on Samburu, we do get more of the generation divide, and we do see the older players trying to recruit Silas here, who throughout the season really comes off as this smarmy and douchey guy, but I still find him to be a fascinating character on the season, where he does go from being the swing vote into becoming the leader of the younger person alliance, dividing the tribe so much that they're pretty much doomed from this point forward. And we do also have this fun moment of Frank trying to talk game with him, but ends up speaking so loudly that Lindsay can hear in on them planning on targeting her. So that's kind of fun. We do have a reward challenge where the most notable thing here is that Kim Johnson ends up falling and is worried about being targeted because of that, which becomes a running theme in the pre-merge here. And does nicely set up her arc for the end of the season, where obviously here she's one of the worst challenge competitors, but by the end of it, she is someone that wins the final 2 immunity challenges. We do have the gross food eating comp here, which is them having to drink cow's blood, which, I'll be honest, seems like one of the more tolerable gross foods in my eyes. I feel like they've definitely had more disgusting things than this. But it really comes down to Kelly versus Linda, where Linda wins in this really fun moment where she just looks like a complete maniac. But on Baran, we do see the foundations of the core alliance for the rest of the season, where Lex approaches Ethan at a point where it already seems like Lex and Tom are already aligned. And I did find it interesting to see Ethan instantly doubt Lex right away, talking about Lex being in the best spot in the game and thinking about the possibility of Lex actually plotting against him. And really, just in general, I was surprised on this rewatch to see how aware Ethan seemed to be in the game. I don't think he really takes full advantage of that awareness, as he does still remain too loyal at points within the game. But I'll say that through this rewatch, my opinion of Ethan's game did go up slightly here. But when it comes down to the vote, Jessie does get a good amount of content throughout the episode, showing how sick she is, to the point where she wasn't drinking of the water. And while Clarence does get set up as a potential boot once again, it was pretty apparent that Jessie was going home here. And I mean, I like Jessie. I know the common assumption is that if Jessie wasn't sick, she would have been this great player or character. And I don't know if I fully subscribe to that. I mean, I like her, but I never really found her to be that interesting. And while she was in talks to be starting this all-women's group, I don't really see that working out for her anyway in the long term, and it really didn't seem like she had that many close allies out there. So while I've always liked Jessie Camacho, I don't really see much potential in her, at least on this individual season. Again, maybe if she were to return on a future season or something, maybe there's more potential, but I don't think Survivor Africa was ever really the cast that she was going to perform that well in. Now for episode 3, which is an episode almost solely about Samburu. Now Baran does win their first reward challenge, which was this boulder rolling competition that I always find synonymous with this season for some reason, even though they do this in other seasons as well. But they end up winning this massive tank of fresh water, which really felt like a massive advantage on this season to have clean water, while the other tribe still has to drink this really disgusting dirt water. But Baran also wins the immunity challenge, which was the classic building an SOS message comp. And while I do have issues with how this comp is easily riggable, Samburu really just sucked here, while Baran did kind of go all out with them running around like lunatics. And we have this notable moment, I guess, of Kim Johnson running around in a thong, which was bizarre. But outside of that, Samburu is really the focus here, with this being the episode where the young versus old battle comes to a head. And through that, we get a lot of fun character moments from the younger players sleeping in, being annoyed at the older players. We do have Brandon cooking breakfast, but gives the younger players more food, We have Carl being upset at Generation X, calling them lazy, which is, again, ironic considering the entire premise of Millennials versus Gen X. We have Carl talking about all the cars that he owns. Again, like, all these are like really fun character moments on this episode. And coming into Tribal, it is pretty clear that it's going to be a 4v4 with a deadlock on the first vote here. And due to the initial tiebreaker of previous votes not being applicable here, because again, this is their first Tribal, we instead get a survival quiz as the tiebreaker, which is really lame. Like, obviously, it would have been better if they had already thought about the concepts of fire making or drawing rocks by this point in Survivor history. But I did feel like for a quiz to determine everything felt very anticlimactic. But Lindsay does end up beating Carl here, and we do lose Carl, who I thought was a fun character while he was there. I mean, him talking about his cars and talking about Gen X are moments that always stand out to me from this season. Really, in the grand scheme of the show, he is probably the least notable figure from this season. But then again, I think that's more of a testament to this cast, as again, I didn't enjoy the little amount of screen time that he did end up getting. Now for episode 4, where we do get to see the ramifications of the Carl boot with the young players celebrating and Lindsay getting really upset at the older players, which further separates the two groups. Linda gets a lot of focus here as this is her boot episode, but she calls out Silas for being phony. We have this ridiculous scene of her jumping up and down and talking about how she just wants to be part of the team and hugs the other players, to which Lindsay is apprehensive, and we have Linda end up asking her, "Did your mama never hug you?" Which, again, really fun character moment for Linda here. Probably her most notable moment of the season. On Baran, we do have a lot of focus being put on the Ethan and Kim Johnson relationship, which obviously plays a massive role in the end game, and is a relationship that essentially wins Ethan the game. We do get a pretty uneventful immunity challenge that Baran ends up winning. And on Samburu, I do think we get some interesting gameplay here from the younger players, where they decide to not tell the older players who they are voting for, which again further separates the groups, but also Silas decides to try to micromanage who that minority ends up voting for. As again, this is a season with previous votes as the tiebreaker, so it is beneficial for the younger players to have the older players put all their votes on Lindsay to not diversify the votes to better their odds later in the game. Again, idealistically, this is the correct move, but Silas just comes off as so see-through here, and with the younger players giving the others no real incentive to follow through with this, they do end up voting for Silas, while the remainder vote for Linda, and Linda ends up getting voted out. And Linda was fun. I mean, she's essentially has two really notable moments on the season. You first have that gross food eating comp, and then you have that scene where she's hugging Lindsay. It felt like she's one of these people that was really only on the show, though, when she was necessary, as before her boot episode, she was largely under-edited, but this episode was a pretty fun one here, largely due to all that she ends up bringing to the table. Now for episode 5, which is a pretty massive episode for Survivor history, where we do get the first ever swap. And I do feel like it works out in the best possible way here, where we do start off the episode with Silas being really upset over the votes put on him the previous night, again further isolating T-Bird and Frank. And ironically, we do also see Brandon being really upset at his alliance members for pissing off the other players and not seeing the big picture, which again, this comes from Brandon, the guy who decides to not flip the game because he doesn't want to be associated with Frank. This is when we get the tree mail telling the tribes to send 3 players on a quest, which I guess they were assuming it was going to be some sort of reward challenge, but obviously it turns out to be the first ever swap, and we have Silas being swapped over along with Frank and T-Bird, the only 2 people from his tribe not in his original alliance, and obviously putting him in a really dangerous position. But this entire scene is really great. I mean, I do feel like Jeff announcing a twist does come off as kind of anticlimactic, where he's very subdued, but the editing is really dramatic when you have the realization from the players at what just happened. It really is an iconic moment in my eyes. But once the tribes are set, we do have the old Baran on Samburu trying to figure out who has votes on them. Obviously the win out in the tiebreaker, which I do find as a fascinating element of gameplay on this season, where Brandon does try to get the votes onto him in order to save Lindsay. Again, I think a lot of drama does come from the previous votes element of this season. I did find that really entertaining. Now, I do think this tiebreaker would be completely broken nowadays, as there are so many ways to manipulate this twist if you have the forethought. But considering the landscape of earlier seasons of the show, I did find this to be pretty fascinating to watch. Even though from a production standpoint, it does have some loopholes in it, as I guess this would mean that players would have to actually count how many votes they have, which usually not all the votes are shown. And while like in Modern Survivor, you kind of have a good sense of how the votes laid out because they do usually show them in an order that makes it apparent what the remaining votes are. It's still weird to have a massive element of the show being keeping count of how many votes each of the players has. Also in this episode, we do have a goat herding reward challenge, so that's something. We do also get Lindsay getting a tick on her ass, so that's also something. But for me, the most interesting part of this episode is the strategy that we get from Ethan, and this is probably Ethan's best individual move throughout the season of him throwing the next immunity challenge in order to vote out Silas, getting rid of the leader of the next biggest alliance within the game, and this being the first ever challenge throw that we at least see on the show itself, which, even up until this point in Survivor history, the show really tries to dissuade challenge throws and really shoves them under the rug in terms of the edit. Namely like in Ghost Island with the Bradley boot being a very clear challenge throw, they showed it as a genuine challenge. So it is interesting that this early on in the show, they did show this increased level of strategy here. But even after this, we do get a lot of scrambling from Silas with him trying to work with Ethan to get rid of Frank, but Ethan tries to get him to go for Clarence, which felt like a questionable move, as wouldn't this incentivize Clarence to flip on Ethan, but whatever. We do get to the vote where it does seem pretty clear by this point that Silas has a good idea that he's going home, and he does end up getting voted out here. And Silas played such a major factor on this season, and to see his downfall in this episode is really incredible. I've always liked watching the arc of Silas over the course of the first 5 episodes here, where you have him rise from the swing vote position into becoming the leader of an alliance, only to then completely wreck his tribe and being taken out at a swap due to those relationships that he ruined. Now, assessing him as a player, I know Silas is looked at as this like swap screwed player, and yes, he does get taken out here earlier than he would have otherwise due to the swap, but really though, his game was already done anyway. Again, by the way he controlled the Samburu tribe, it made it so abundantly clear that T-Bird and Frank were going to flip at the first opportunity. Even if they had made the merge, and if they didn't make the merge, then their best chance is Clarence flipping over and causing a tie, in which Boron has the advantage anyway due to both Lindsay and Silas having votes against them at that point. So, really, Silas was already in a losing position here. I do think he has some interesting ideas throughout the season, but just executed them terribly. So it makes it really tough to think of him as that great of a player and someone that was that screwed over. Now for episode 6, where Boron doesn't have that much to do here, but we do get this fun saga around Clarence and the chickens, with him wanting to eat one and telling the tribe that he's going to kill one if they don't lay an egg the next morning, after having never laid an egg up until that point in the season. And of course, the next morning it does, leading to a fun reaction from him and him telling each of the chickens that he hates them. So that's all really fun, but most of the action here does come from Samburu, with them eventually going to tribal, and we do get a lot more talk about previous votes. And at the reward challenge, we do get some strong gameplay from Kim Johnson, with her making an L symbol to tell the others that Lindsay is the one that has votes against her, and this does end up deciding the next vote. But we do also get a lot of intrigue along the way, with Lindsay realizing how much danger she's in and considers throwing Brandon under a bus and voting for him in an attempt to save herself. And while she doesn't end up doing so, I do think this is indicative of a more individualistic look at the game that we had rarely seen up until this point in this show. But we do get the tribal, where we do get a tie between Lindsay and Tom, meaning we know that essentially Lindsay is going home. And Lindsay does get up to leave right away, only for Jeff to scold her for doing so and telling her to sit down. And that's always been a fun moment in my eyes, but we do get to a revote where afterwards Lindsay is formally eliminated. And I love Lindsay as a character on the season. Yes, she does show some immaturity along the way. Yes, she can come off as annoying, but she did make for some pretty great TV while she was here. Her and Silas were essentially these figureheads for that younger person alliance, and the ones blamed for everything wrong that the young players did. And like Silas, I don't see any way that she ends up winning the season, with her probably going home immediately after Silas in most scenarios. And even if she doesn't, she probably loses a jury vote to how annoying she was perceived to be. But Lindsay is someone that I think would be fun to have return to the show at some point. Do I think it's likely? Probably not, but definitely an underappreciated figure for the show. that I don't think gets talked about that much nowadays. Now for episode 7, which is the merge episode, but before the merge, we do get a lot of setup for potential conflicts moving forward, with Brandon talking about how happy he is that Lindsay is gone and about her not leaving with dignity despite him trying to save her the previous round, which again made no real sense, but really just shows how flip-floppy Brandon is, which obviously we'll see more of moving down the road. We do also see Kelly being annoyed at Lex and how he's sucking up to people, and that obviously has a direct influence later on the season as well. We do get to the actual merge itself, which happens pretty unceremoniously at the Immunity Challenge, but the Immunity Challenge itself is pretty fun. It is the first appearance of the When It Rains It Pours endurance comp, where we do get this iconic T-Bird moment of her singing Tomorrow from Annie. But really, the more notable moment here for me is this deal that T-Bird and Clarence make, where they end up playing rock, paper, scissors to decide the winner of the challenge, in which T-Bird ends up winning here. And this deal that they end up making does play a pretty major role in the remainder of the season, as this causes T-Bird to throw her vote onto Lex, causing this massive witch hunt in the next episode that really does dictate the rest of the game. This episode does also feature a good amount of Frank content, with the most notable moment for me coming from the tribe playing Never Have I Ever, and I just love Frank's contribution in him saying that he's never broken the word of a handshake, which obviously doesn't fit into the tone of what the game is supposed to be, but here the boot does pretty clearly fall onto Clarence, with Lex getting the credit for the move on the show, but we also get Lex directly telling Clarence that he's going home, which, from watching Lex on 2 seasons now, obviously it's his MO. Also, it's just terrible gameplay on his end, with Clarence starting to campaign against him and ends up putting his vote on him to make it hard for him to win. Again, it really just all backfires on Lex, even though Clarence ends up getting voted out anyway. And Clarence is another character I really love on this season, one that I definitely think was underappreciated at the time, but Clarence is really the person that made up a lot of the entertainment that was going on the Baron tribe. While that tribe does have some massive figures like Ethan, Lex, and Tom on it, I don't feel like those people really shine until the post-merge of this season. And I do think Clarence really carries that tribe entertainment-wise for a lot of the pre-merge. I mean, you have Beangate, you have these fun character moments like his hatred of the chickens. And again, out of the earlier boots from this era of the show, I do think Clarence is the person that I would be the most excited to see play again at this point. I feel like he would have a lot more potential in the modern game of the show, but again, something I don't think is super likely. Now for episode 8, which is technically not episode 8 because there was a recap episode, but for the sake of this retrospective, we'll be ignoring that as it isn't part of the core narrative of the season. But this episode here is probably the best episode of the season. I mean, we started off with Lex's witch hunt to find who was the second vote against him, with him thinking it was Kelly, while obviously it was T-Bird, and we get this great confessional from her saying, "It was me." And Lex just gets portrayed pretty negatively here, obviously, like, again, with us knowing that he's wrong, and him talking about how he fully believes T-Bird. We do also get a reward challenge here that leads to one of the most iconic rewards in my eyes, where Ethan wins a trip to a local village where he's given goats that he's allowed to barter with. And he does end up taking Lex along, leading to this really fun sequence of events of them going from shop to shop, bartering for food and souvenirs. We do also get this iconic scene of Ethan playing hacky sack with the children in the village, which he later cites as the inspiration for him starting grassroots soccer. And all this for me just comes off as very iconic. But strategically, back at camp, I did like how T-Bird utilized Lex and Ethan being gone as an opportunity to attempt a coup against Lex, and tries to get the original Samburu back together along with flipping Kelly to their side, which later does become somewhat effective once Lex gets word from Brandon that Kelly called herself a free agent, leading to Lex clearly going after Kelly, essentially kicking her out of the alliance and replacing her with Brandon, which is, again, such terrible gameplay from Lex, just giving Kelly to the other side to where if Brandon wasn't Brandon, Lex would be going home here. Now, I do think you have to credit Lex for making Brandon comfortable enough to want to move forward in the game with him, but I do think the bigger factor here was Brandon not wanting to work with Frank due to Frank's homophobic nature, and while I do get that from a personal level, from a game level, that is abhorrent gameplay from Brandon as well, with him giving up any chance of him reaching the end game because of this, since he didn't have a good bond with anyone outside of Lex within the group that he was jumping to. With that tribal, we do get this really iconic voting confessional from Kelly as she votes out Lex, but I did find it really questionable that they end up showing Brandon's vote for Kelly, which really takes all the suspense out of the vote here, where it clearly becomes a 5-4 vote with Kelly going home. And Kelly Goldsmith is another fantastic character for the show. I do feel like she was under-edited early on, but in her last few episodes, she does get some really great content, especially in relation to her hostile relationship with Lex. She's another one that I would really like to see play Survivor again, and I do think there is a semblance of a chance for that. I do think she is a good candidate for a second chance season. I do believe she has been called to come back for recent seasons, so I do think there is at least some of a chance we do see her again. I do think she plays decently well on this season. It is mostly targeted due to Lex's witch hunt, which for the most part was out of her control. Now, I do think if she had managed her relationship with Lex better, technically, he probably wouldn't have suspected her, but still, I do feel like there's a lot of variance in that. I do love how willing she was to flip in the game, though, almost being a part of this first major post-merge flip that, again, if it wasn't for Brandon, I could see a world where she tries to dynamically maneuver through the game in a way that we later see like Rob Cesternino or Johnny Fairplay do. So I do think Kelly was a player that was well ahead of her time, and I do think it would have been interesting to see her play had Brandon done what was in his best interest. But now for episode 9, which was the last episode before the season really slows down. I mean, while the boot here is kind of obvious, seeing Brandon pay for the terrible move he made in the previous episode was pretty satisfying, with us seeing the consequences of being the sole person to flip on a vote, where Kim talks about feeling betrayed by him, and both Ethan and Tom, who Brandon helped in the last vote, want to get rid of him as well, as they just simply don't trust him. Brandon also gets some pretty great content here through his iconic reward, where Brandon and Frank have to watch a movie together, which I personally never found this to be that great of a moment. I know a lot of people find this scene to be really humorous, but for me, the scene never really worked, especially because I think you watch the scene and expect them to have some level of respect for each other by the end of the reward, but you don't get that, and they still hate each other. But when it comes to the vote, again, it's pretty clear that Brandon is going home here, but I do want to talk about a couple things here. First is that there was another wasted opportunity for Brandon here and the rest of Samburu to potentially vote together, as they still had half of the tribe here, and it would have been a plurality vote here if they had gotten their act together. With Tom, Ethan, and Kim Johnson voting for Brandon, Lex voting for Frank, if they put their 4 votes together, they could have easily blindsided a Tom or an Ethan, but they obviously don't. The other thing of intrigue here is the fact that Lex doesn't get his way here. Whenever I do think about Survivor Africa, I do usually think of it as a season that is dominated by Lex. And while I do still think that Lex had an impressive run here and probably would have won if he had gotten to the end against any of the other Baron members, I do still think that it is interesting that Tom and Ethan overpower him in the decision making here. And through that, again, I do think my respect for Ethan's game in particular did go up a little bit after realizing that. But let's talk about Brandon, who, is fine. I do think he is a competent player. He did seem to be a decent social player, with him having good relationships early on and also after a swap. But I do think his unwillingness to compromise his morals did end up dooming his game. I do think he saw the benefit in voting for Samburu, but was just unwilling to do so because that would mean he would have to align with Frank. And I still think a lot of this has to do with the era that he ends up playing in. Again, this era of the show where homophobia was still a prominent concept within the cast. And I do think he would have performed better on a modern season. But still, on this individual season, it is a massive mistake that does end up costing him the game. Though realistically, again, one that I don't really see him doing if this was a modern season of the show. Now for episode 10, which from this point until the finale, the season really does slow down quite a bit. Easily being the worst part of the season, as from this point on, it's pretty clear that Baron is going to stick together. But here we do get the auction, which is really fun. While I don't love that they use shillings as the currency, which made it very tough to quantify the value of what they are bidding, we do still get some really great character moments here, with a lot of them coming from how unregulated this auction was, with there being a lot of pooling money and Kim Johnson negotiating deals for part of her meal. The most notable moment here comes from Tom and Ethan winning this massive breakfast, and Tom celebrating instantly that Ethan is a Jew, meaning that he won't eat the ham. And I know that some people think that this is really insensitive and offensive, but I still find this to be a really fun character moment because, like, for me, the moment isn't about Tom yelling out that he's Jewish, but more so about Big Tom instantly realizing right after he sees the food the ramifications of that. And I always found that to be the humorous part of this moment, but really the rest of the episode is dedicated to throwing Frank under the bus, where we do get this segment about him talking about his guns and making Lex and Ethan uncomfortable. And T-Bird starts to get a decent amount of content at the end of the episode where she tries to get Frank to stop talking about that. We do also see her trying to flip Kim Johnson on Ethan, which was never going to work, but it's nice to see her try. But again, obviously we do lose Frank here, with T-Bird deciding to vote for him as well, as obviously he was going home. And Frank is one of these people that has not aged well on this season, with him being a pretty clear homophobic and possibly misogynistic figure, which, I mean, the misogyny we technically didn't see much of on the show, but it is talked about a lot by the other players, where we do get talk about how he won't vote for a woman to win the game. But despite that, I do think we still get some entertaining character moments that mostly stem from his awkwardness around the other players. Obviously, he is a bad player, one that most of the tribes seem to dislike, and because of that, I really just can't see him ever winning the game under any realistic scenario. Now for episode 11, which was another slow episode, I mean, we do have this interesting reward challenge where each player got a video from home and they had to play the match game with their family members, and this does lead to us learning more about pretty much everyone there. And Lex does end up winning this here, where he does get to use Jeff's personal visa, for some reason, to go on a hot air balloon with Tom, and this is a pretty notable moment for me, mainly because of how drunk Big Tom gets during this reward. But afterwards, the rest of the episode's pretty bland, with no real setup to the boot here, where Kim Powers ends up going home here pretty unceremoniously. And Kim Powers is someone that I found mostly likable during the rewatch here, and someone that I'm disappointed didn't have much more of a role on this season. She just didn't seem that important to the overall story that they were trying to tell, where really she doesn't get her own story or arc throughout the season. It's really as if the editors didn't really know what to do with her, to where again in her boot episode here, they really don't do much setup to her actually going home, unlike what they did with pretty much every boot for the rest of the season. So while I do like Kim Powers, and to be honest, my respect for her game did go up probably a little bit during the rewatch here, she doesn't really have that much to do on the season itself. Now for episode 12, the penultimate episode, but also another pretty slow episode that did get a bit more interesting towards the end, but overall still probably below average. Lex does win the reward here, winning a car, again further perpetuating this car curse that would become prominent moving forward. But also Lex gets to deliver medical supplies to a local hospital, and this is the first of these like humanitarian rewards that I do find pretty boring typically, but this one does feel pretty impactful, with this being an AIDS hospital and T-Bird talking about having a connection to it. But after this, we do get some interesting strategy, though it never really felt like anything from this was ever going to go through. We do get a lot of T-Bird campaigning initially against Lex, and we do hear Kim Johnson talking about how she doesn't want to go to the end with Lex and Big Tom, and does attempt to get Ethan to flip, though obviously Ethan is never going to flip here. And once Lex wins immunity, T-Bird does one last ditch effort to try to flip the target onto Tom, throwing Tom under the bus to Lex, to the point where Lex at least considers flipping the vote onto Tom, but again, it doesn't end up mattering, and T-Bird goes home here. And T-Bird's great. I mean, another person that I would love to see return on a modern season. It would have been great to see her on Second Chance, but for some reason she didn't get voted in. I will say that T-Bird's edit was a bit quieter than I remembered, where for most of the season, the other people in the older person alliance, namely Frank, ends up getting more of the content than her. But I do think there is a serious argument for T-Bird being one of the best players of this era of the show. She is one of the first players to show this ability to plot against a majority, with her almost pulling off that Lex blindside at the final 9. She constantly works to flip the game from that point forward, and while it never ends up working for her, I do think she shows a lot of potential to succeed within a modern landscape of the show, more so than I would say for most of the other players from this era of the show. But now let's move on to the finale, which is a solid one that does have a bevy of memorable moments, though it's one that also falls into similar traps that we get from earlier finales. We do start off the episode with the most interesting part of the camp life of the episode, where we do see Lex confronting Tom about what T-Bird told him, and this leads to a pretty fun back and forth and really just sets up the Tom boot for later in the episode. We do get this infamous Fallen Comrades challenge, which comes down to the final question between Lex and Kim Johnson, where they are asked which player has no piercings. Kim ends up answering Kelly and gets it right, winning immunity, while Lex ends up answering Lindsay, and at the time is declared wrong. However, it turns out that when the players were watching the episode together during the night of the finale, Lindsay revealed that Lex was actually right, as she also didn't have any piercings, leading to this controversy post-show where supposedly both Tom and Lex were given second place prize money and a guaranteed spot on Survivor All-Stars. And from what I understand, this is also what incentivized them to do the Fallen Comrades challenge moving forward. Obviously, we do see it one more time in Marquesas, though that was obviously filmed before this controversy happened. And I know Fallen Comrades as a competition gets some mixed reception. I do have some reverence for it. I do like the fact that this is a competition based around how much you like the other players, kind of fulfilling the themes of the game, especially at this point in the show, where the show heavily relies on the more social elements of the game, while now obviously we focus a lot more on the strategy. Though, to be honest, in a way I do kind of miss this being an element of the show of you having to know about the players that you're playing with. But back to the Lex situation. While it is a shame that something like this did happen, it wasn't really a guarantee that Lex would have won the season had this not happened. As again, really all this would lead to is another tiebreaker where obviously there's still a 50% chance of the same result, while the other half leads to Kim getting voted out and Tom making the final three, who Lex probably has an easier time winning against in the final immunity challenge, but Tom's still someone that's not taking Lex to the end. So this is something that never really affected my opinions on the season that much, as again, it really isn't a guarantee of what would have happened had everything played out correctly here. But we do lose Tom, who is a great character on this season, but is also one that, again, hasn't aged particularly well. While at the time his comments would come off as humorous, now they could definitely be looked at as misogynistic, with also some racial undertones as well. I mean, his actions and comments haven't aged well at all. Though, as a character on the show, I do still find him pretty fascinating. I mean, he was obviously a fan favorite at the time, and is someone that is clearly a smarter player than you would assume considering his demeanor. If he were able to get to the end against Kim Johnson or possibly even Ethan, I do think he has a good chance of winning the game. Now, I don't have much interest in seeing him play again, but I do still find him to be a pretty interesting relic from these older seasons. And then we jump to the final three, where the episode does slow down a bit. We do waste a lot of time here before getting to the final immunity challenge, which is the classic hands on a hard idol, where Kim Johnson kind of wins by default. Obviously, she does last a while, and it is still an impressive win, but first, Ethan does end up having a phobia of vomiting and supposedly loses balance after seeing a production member puke off screen, and to be honest, even if that wasn't true, him falling did feel very fluky. And then you also have Lex, who was sick coming into this challenge, and more than likely would have won if he wasn't sick. But either way, with Kim Johnson having final immunity and her having such a close bond with Ethan, it was pretty clear Lex was being voted out here. And Lex is another really fascinating character on this season, with him being one of the first domineering figures to almost win the game. I mean, he is the first person to be the clear leader of the Majority Alliance to actually get towards the end of the game and probably win if he had gotten to the end. He clearly beats Kim and more than likely wins against Ethan based on what we've heard from people like T-Bird nowadays. Lex did definitely play this season the hardest, but I have come to question his game more and more over time. He is certainly a flawed player, but I do think at this point, I would really debate between him and Ethan over who is the better player. Which, if you asked me before this rewatch, it would have been a clear runaway for Lex. But I think as time's gone on, I do think Lex's game doesn't particularly age well. Despite that, though, Lex is still a pretty legendary figure of the game, especially after his run on All-Stars. And he does completely dominate the airtime on the post-merge section of this season. And it's still someone that I wouldn't mind seeing back nowadays, to see him try to approach the modern landscape of Survivor. Now, after this, not much actually happens between this and Final Tribal, though right before Tribal, we do hear from Ethan where he states it's going to be a 4-3 vote, where he thinks that Brandon is going to be the swing, which is interesting considering how he treats Brandon at Final Tribal. And this Final Tribal has some pretty notable moments here. Again, Ethan's answer to Brandon's question is completely asinine, where Brandon asks who is the least deserving, clearly looking for Frank as the answer, and instead Ethan just says you, which ends up losing him Brandon's vote in this situation. Now again, I don't know if Frank is the right answers. that could have lost him Frank's vote, but still the answer is not to say Brandon here, especially when you think he is the swing vote. And Ethan really is just lucky that he had these other votes in the bag that he didn't think he was going to get to begin with. But I did also like that Kim here answers with Tom, which I do think is a great move for her, knowing that Tom won't ever vote for her. And I did like that she also picks Tom later when asked who he learned the least from. And I do think this is actually a pretty good final tribal performance from Kim Johnson, all things considered, while Ethan performs pretty terribly here. Tom also has a pretty ridiculous question of his own, where he is clearly drunk during this and asks about a hyena eating mush. And like both the players actually take this question so seriously, which I always find really funny. But the votes get cast, and afterwards they try to fake out the audience to make it seem like they're reading the votes immediately afterwards, only for it to be revealed that it's the reunion show once Ethan is declared the winner. And I always found this decision to be strange, them having to dress up in their old clothes and regrow their facial hair and all that stuff. It really felt like a pointless thing to do in my eyes. Like, I always felt weird that Ethan's winning $1 million in these like ratted up clothes while just being in the middle of this like production studio. But he does end up winning the game here in a 5-2 vote. Now, before we wrap up the video here, let's talk about the final two, starting off with Kim Johnson, who I was pleasantly surprised with on the rewatch here. I do think this rewatch really booned my opinion of her game as a whole, where before I always looked at her as someone that was just dragged along in the game and didn't really do much. And even beyond that, had to win those final couple immunity challenges to get to the end. And to be honest, while some of that is still kind of true, I do give her a lot more credit for her awareness within the game. I mean, it did seem like she had a decent read on the game throughout most of it. And in the end game, she knew the move that she needed to make and did contemplate voting against Tom and Lex. The problem is her loyalty to Ethan. And I think that greatly harmed her in the game in terms of her winning chances. Though I do think aligning with Ethan got her to that position to begin with, where I do think if she hadn't done that, she could have been a pre-merge boot. And I do think if she wasn't this like 58-year-old grandma, people would have probably respected her game a lot more out there than what they ended up doing. I mean, like, Kim doesn't play an amazing game by any means, but my opinion of her game did definitely go up quite a bit here, despite her still being a pretty boring character for the show. And finally, let's talk about Ethan, who, like Kim, my opinion of his game has gone up quite a bit here. While I do still have some of the same flaws I had with him beforehand, again, I still think he's too loyal to Lex and Tom, to the point where if his ideal situation played out, he probably loses the game to Lex. But I will still give him a lot of credit for building these really strong relationships within his core alliance, to where he was always the best positioned person within the game. Again, he falters in his relationships outside of that core, but he did get to the Final Four situation where everyone was taking him to the end. Now, I do feel like his only guaranteed win was against Kim Johnson, while the other two are a lot more questionable, but still to have that positioning in a position where you can also still win the game is really, really impressive. Now, again, I don't know how much of that was active work on his end, but it's still impressive nonetheless. I will also say that I do think he had a bit more control in how the game played out than what I used to give him credit for as well. I mean, obviously he does pull off the Silas move, but I do also think he deserves some credit for the Brandon boot as well. He did also seem to be the one keeping Kim in check, with us getting a lot of screen time of Kim thinking about flipping, only to go to Ethan, who immediately shuts it down. I do think Ethan was pretty important to the amount of control that Lex ended up having in the game, but again, I still think he has those flaws that come from him trying to play this loyal game. But Ethan is still the first heroic winner for the show, showing that a nice guy can win Survivor, which I do think is also worth note here. Though obviously his exact game is something tough to really replicate on a modern season, a more strategic season of the show, as I do feel like a lot of Ethan's positioning within the game was simply just him being likable and also athletic enough to be put into the majority alliance right away, and him really bonding with those people as the season progressed. I don't know how much of that was him actively doing things. Again, like, he isn't even the one to start the alliance with Lex and Tom. It's Lex approaching Ethan to join their alliance. Again, like, I do still think he's a bit too passive and a bit too loyal, but overall my opinion did go up on him as a whole. But that's it for Survivor Africa, a season that I still have a lot of reverence for. While it's a radically different show from what we would see from a more modern season of Survivor, this is still a season that I do largely enjoy watching due to how different of a season it is. I do really like the cast, and I do think that they brought a lot of great character moments along the way. And while there is some problematic behaviors and comments on this season, they aren't nearly as impactful to the season as something like a Thailand or an All-Stars for me. Africa for me is still a pretty good season, though I don't think my rewatch has really changed my opinion on it that much. I pretty much just still stand by its placement on the season ranking videos I've done in the past. While I think you can debate it moving up maybe 1 or 2 spots, my opinions of it as a whole have largely stayed the same. So those are my thoughts on Survivor Africa. Like my previous retrospectives, I do plan on following this up with a player ranking down the road. I also will be continuing on with Marquesas and beyond when those respective 20th anniversaries come up. But for now, that is my retrospective for Survivor Africa. Thank you for watching.